Season 1, Episode 15, The Farewell. The House of Wisdom, Season 1, Episode 15. The 9th year had been the year of proof. 30,000 men through a summer desert. The frontier reorganized. The hypocrite's mask finally fully removed. The tribes of Arabia arriving in Medina one after another. Delegations from every direction of the peninsula. Pledging, asking, receiving instruction, returning home with teachers. The year of deputations, the historians would call it. The world was coming to him now. The work of 23 years was resolving into something that looked, from the outside, like completion. But the people closest to him, Abu Bakr, who reads silences the way a navigator reads stars, had begun to feel something shift. If you are new to this channel, every episode in this series connects. We have been building this history from the beginning, from the streets of pre-Islamic Mecca to this moment, the last pilgrimage, the final address. Subscribe now so you are here when the next chapter opens. What comes after this episode is the hardest thing this history contains. You need to be here for it. It is the 10th year of Hijrah, the month of Dhul Qa'dah, and a call has gone out across Arabia unlike any that has preceded it. The Prophet ﷺ is going to Mecca to perform Hajj, not a raid, not a campaign, not a diplomatic mission. The Hajj, the ancient rite that had been corrupted for centuries under the weight of idolatry and tribal politics and commercial self-interest, that had been restored to its original form after the conquest of Mecca, that now stood as the central gathering of a community that had spent 23 years being built in pain and blood and mercy and sacrifice. He was going to perform it in full, and everyone who could come was invited to witness it. More than 100,000 people answered. Understand the scale of what this means in the world of the 7th century. There was no mechanism of mass communication beyond the human voice carried on horseback from tribe to tribe. There were no roads in the Roman sense, no logistics infrastructure, no coordinating bureaucracy. What assembled at the plains of Arafat in Dhul Hijjah of the 10th year was a human convergence of a kind that the Arabian Peninsula had never seen, drawn not by a king's command, not by the promise of plunder, not by the threat of consequence, but by the threat of consequence, but by the pull of something that had no precedent in the history of that world. The Prophet ﷺ left Medina on the 25th of Dhul Qa'dah. He was in a state of ihram, the pilgrim's garments, the 2 unsewn white cloths, the deliberate stripping away of rank and distinction that the Hajj demands of every person who enters it, from the most powerful to the most vulnerable. He rode his she-camel, al-Qaswa. He had brought with him 100 sacrificial camels. Ali ibn Abi Talib came from Yemen, where he had been sent to collect zakat and teach. He arrived in time to join the pilgrimage, and when the 2 groups met on the road into Mecca, the sources record a moment of minor tension that resolved into something instructive. Some of the men Ali had led from Yemen had complaints about the distribution of certain goods, and a few of them arrived in Medina before Ali, with those complaints already formed into grievances. Ali reached the Prophet ﷺ and was met, not with rebuke, but with the same question he had answered at Tabuk, not about guilt, but about understanding. The matters were resolved. Ali performed Hajj at the Prophet's side. This detail matters because the farewell pilgrimage is sometimes rendered as a moment of pure, luminous unity, as though the human texture had been smoothed away in the retelling. It was not. There were logistics that went wrong. There were frictions in the margins. There were the ordinary difficulties of moving more than 100,000 people through a series of sacred rites in the heat of the Arabian winter. What makes the farewell pilgrimage extraordinary is not that it was frictionless. It is that at the center of all that complexity, at the still point around which more than 100,000 lives were temporarily organizing, was one man who had been preparing for this moment, consciously or not, for 23 years. The caravan arrived in Mecca on the 4th of Dhul Hijjah. The Prophet performed the tawaf, the circumambulation of the Kaaba, 7 circuits around the house that Ibrahim had built and that had been returned 2 years earlier to the worship for which it was originally constructed. He performed the sa'i between Safa and Marwa. He instructed the pilgrims in the rites with the precision of a man who understood that every person watching him was watching, in part, to learn. The sources note that he said repeatedly, "Take your rights from me, for I do not know whether I will perform Hajj after this year." That sentence landed differently on different ears. For some, it was practical instruction, a reminder to observe carefully and remember accurately. For Abu Bakr, who had been alongside this man for more than 20 years, through the cave at Thawr and Badr and Uhud and the trench in Hudaybiyah and the conquest in Tabuk, Abu Bakr heard something else. He wept. The sources record it without elaboration, which is its own form of eloquence. The weeping does not need explanation. On the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, the entire assembly moved to the plain of Arafat. Arafat is not dramatic terrain. It is a wide, flat, sun-hammered expanse east of Mecca, bounded on one side by a modest granite hill, Jabal al-Rahma, the Mount of Mercy. The plane itself is unremarkable in the way that the most important stages of history are often unremarkable in their physical appearance. What made it extraordinary on this day was the assembly of human beings that covered it. More than 100,000 people in their white garments, facing the same direction, their voices rising in the talbiyah, Labaik, Allahumma labaik. Here I am, O God. Here I am. The Prophet ﷺ rode al-Qaswa to the valley of Irana at the edge of Arafat. A tent of animal skins had been erected for him. He rested briefly, then called for his camel, mounted her, and rode to the middle of the valley where the gathering was assembled. He began to speak. The address at Arafat is one of the most analyzed texts in Islamic history and one of the most misunderstood in its rendering. It is sometimes presented as a collection of legal pronouncements, a final legislative summary, the closing arguments of a juridical career. It is that, but it is not only that. What the sources preserve is a speech that moves between registers, from the immediate and practical to the cosmic and final, with the fluency of a man who has spent his entire life learning to hold both at once. He opened by acknowledging that he did not know if he would stand in this place again. He then addressed the bloodshed of the pre-Islamic period, the feuds, the cycles of revenge, the tribal accounting that had kept Arabia in a state of low-grade civil war for generations. All of it, he declared, was now under his feet. The blood debts were cancelled. The usury was abolished. The first specific example he gave was from his own family. The interest owed to his uncle Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, cancelled now in this place, before this gathering. He began the abolition with his own house. There was no ambiguity about where the obligation of reform fell first. He spoke about women. The passage has been the subject of more commentary than almost any other in the address, and it requires honest engagement. He acknowledged that men had rights over their wives, and that wives had rights over their husbands, and he named both. He instructed the men assembled before him to treat women well, to fear God in how they treated them, and he used the word amanah, trust, to describe what a woman represents in the household. She is not property. She is a trust. The entire framework of the instruction rested on accountability to God for how that trust was honored. He spoke about the rights of Muslims over one another, the inviolability of life, property, and honor. He named these rights as sacred as the sacredness of this day, in this month, in this place. That triple emphasis was deliberate. Arafat, on the day of Arafat in Dhul Hijjah. If the sacredness of the Hajj was something his audience understood in their bones, and it was, because they had grown up in a culture that observed the sacred months even in the depths of the age of ignorance, then the rights he was naming carried the same weight. He spoke about the Quran and the Sunnah. He said, and this is the sentence that generations of scholars have returned to, that was preserved in multiple variants, all converging on the same essential formulation, that he was leaving among them two things, and that as long as they held to both, they would not go astray. Then he said, have I conveyed the message? More than 100,000 voices answered, yes. He said, O God, bear witness. He said it 3 times. Among the people on that plain, there was a man who had been waiting for this moment without knowing he had been waiting for it. Umar ibn al-Khattab, the man who had converted to Islam by reading a page of the Quran in his sister's house, who had once proposed killing every prisoner at Badr, whose very footsteps Satan was said to avoid, who would become the second caliph and the conqueror of Persia and Rome. Umar ibn al-Khattab wept at Arafat. He wept because of a verse that came down on that day. It descended in the middle of the afternoon, while the Prophet's soul was still on the plain. The sources record that he was on al-Qaswa when the revelation came, and that the weight of it was such that the she-camel's forelegs buckled slightly under the descent of what was being placed. The verse was, This day I have perfected for you your religion and completed my favor upon you and have approved for you Islam as your religion. Most of the companions who heard it rejoiced. The perfection of the religion, the completion of the favor, seemed like the crowning confirmation of everything they had endured and built. For Abu Bakr and Umar it landed differently. Abu Bakr wept. Umar wept. When someone asked Umar why he was weeping at what seemed like the greatest glad tiding, he answered with the logic of a man who understood endings. Because perfection means completion. Completion means the work is done. And when the work is done, the one who is sent to do it has fulfilled his purpose. The verse was not only a celebration. It was a farewell written into the architecture of revelation itself. This is the moment to pause and apply the historic war lens to what is happening on this plane. Not in the military sense, but in the civilizational one, which is the deeper sense. 23 years earlier, a man had stood alone in a city that mocked him, delivering a message that no one wanted. The city that produced him had driven him out. The empire to his north had been warned, and had torn the warning to pieces. The empire to his northeast had been warned, and had accepted the respect due a foreign dignitary, while doing nothing with the content. Tribes had refused him. Individuals had attempted to assassinate him. A social boycott had reduced his community to eating leaves from the trees to survive. 1,000 swords had come for him at Uhud and driven him into a ditch. Now, on the plain of Arafat, more than 100,000 human beings were wearing his religion on their bodies and speaking his language and carrying the text of his revelation in their memories, and a verse had descended from the God he had been sent to proclaim, saying, "It is complete." What the historian of civilization must ask is not how this happened. The mechanisms are traceable, the decisions documented, the battles recorded, but what this means as a pattern of human history. Because what happened here is not merely extraordinary by the standards of 7th century Arabia. It is extraordinary by any standard, in any century. The idea that a single man, beginning with zero institutional power, no military force, no inherited political authority, no treasury, in 23 years could produce not merely a religion, but a functional state, a legal system, a set of values capable of generating military and political coherence at continental scale, without the corruption of the message that typically accompanies such compression. This stands without parallel in the documented record of human civilization. Whether one approaches this as a believer or as a historian, the category it belongs to is not reducible to the ordinary categories of political success or military achievement. Something else was at work here. The sources say so, the scale says so, and on the plain of Arafat in the 10th year of Hijrah, the verse said so. After Arafat, the pilgrimage continued through its remaining rites, the night at Muzdalifah, the stoning of the Jamarat at Mina, the sacrifice, the circumambulation. The Prophet ﷺ moved through each station with the same care and deliberateness he had brought to every station of the pilgrimage, knowing that every movement was being recorded in the memory of 100,000 witnesses, who would carry it home to every corner of the world he had spent 23 years addressing. At Ghadir Khumm, a place on the road back to Medina, a crossroads where the paths to different destinations diverged, where the pilgrims from different regions would begin separating to go home, he called for the people to assemble. He had something to say before they scattered. The sources record that he spoke of his own death openly, not as a speculation, as a near certainty. He said, "I am about to be called, and I will respond." He said, "I am leaving among you 2 things." And he restated what he had said at Arafat. Then he said, and the sources record this with the specificity that marks a statement preserved, because those who heard it understood its weight. He said, "Ali is the friend of whoever considers me their friend." The full theological and political interpretation of that statement became one of the most contested passages in Islamic history. What is not contested is that it was said, at Ghadir Khumm, on the return from the farewell pilgrimage, in the hearing of every person on that road. Whatever its precise significance, it was a public, unreserved, final form expression of the bond between the Prophet ﷺ and the man he had described at Tabuk as being to him as Harun was to Musa. The thread that had been woven through the entire series, Ali at every critical moment, Ali given the trusts to return in Mecca while the Prophet ﷺ escaped to the cave, Ali at Badr and Uhud and Khaybar and the conquest. That thread was tied here, publicly, at a crossroads, in the hearing of everyone who was still walking the road back from the place where a verse had declared the religion complete. Umar ibn al-Khattab congratulated Ali. The sources preserve this. The Prophet ﷺ arrived back in Medina and resumed the work of governance. Letters went out. Delegations were received. Zakat collectors were dispatched. The administrative machinery of the young state continued to turn. But in Safar of the 11th year, he felt the first signs of what would become his final illness. He had gone out in the night to the cemetery of Baqi to pray for the dead, a practice he had established for the community, a reminder that the living were always in conversation with those who had preceded them. When he returned home, his head was aching. Over the following days the fever came, and with it the unmistakable weight of something that was not ordinary illness. He asked his wives if he might spend the days of his illness in the room of one of them. They agreed, and he chose Aisha. He moved into her room, the small chamber that faced the mosque, and for the remaining days of his life, he would drift between the mosque and that room, between the demands of leadership and the bed where Aisha sat and held his head in her lap. Usama ibn Zayd, the son of the Zayd ibn Haritha, who had been the first commander at Mu'tah, the son of the man the Prophet She had freed and adopted and loved before revelation clarified the nature of adoption, was appointed to lead a military expedition to the Syrian frontier. He was 17 years old by some accounts. He was given the standard by the Prophet Shizam's own hands. The same objections that had greeted the appointment of his father to lead before Mu'tah were raised again. Too young, too inexperienced, the wrong lineage for command. The Prophet Shizam answered with the same authority he had always brought to such objections. Usama commands. The expedition halted outside Medina when the illness deepened, waiting. He went to the mosque to lead the prayers as long as he was able. When he could no longer go, he asked that Abu Bakr lead in his place. Aisha suggested Umar. He said, "No, Abu Bakr." She suggested it again. perhaps sensing something about the weight of what this appointment meant, the symbolic compression of leadership that prayer in front of the community represented, the way that whoever stood in that place at that moment would stand there in history. He said, "No, Abu Bakr." Abu Bakr led the prayers. On a Monday morning in Rabi al-Awwal of the 11th year, the Prophet felt well enough to lift the curtain between Aisha's room and the mosque. The people were in their rows for the Fajr prayer, Abu Bakr at their head. When they saw him lift the curtain, saw his face, saw him watching them at prayer, something moved through the congregation that the sources describe as joy, the kind of joy that loosens a man's knees. Abu Bakr sensed the shift in the rows behind him and began to step back, to yield his place. The Prophet motioned for him to remain. He sat at the doorway and watched the prayer from there, smiling. Then he let the curtain fall. The congregation understood that this was something. They could not have articulated precisely what, but the quality of the smile, the quality of the watching. Something in the men who had been with him longest heard in that moment the particular sound of a farewell. He returned to Aisha's room. She took his head in her lap. She had a siwak, a tooth-cleaning stick, that belonged to her brother, and she chewed it soft and handed it to him. He used it. These are the details the sources preserve. The chewed siwak, the head in her lap, the cup of water nearby, his hand dipped in it to wipe his face. The intimate domesticity of the final hours. The smallness of the room in which the completion of the largest work in the history of the Arabian world was taking place. He spoke. The sources record fragments. Words asking for the company of the highest. A hand gesturing upward. A phrase that came out more as breath than speech. And then his head grew heavy in Aisha's lap. In the mosque, Abu Bakr was at his house nearby when the news came. He returned, walked through the crowd without speaking, entered Aisha's room, drew back the covering, looked at the face of the man he had followed since the first day of the call, leaned down and kissed his forehead. He said, "You were precious in life, and you are precious in death." Then he walked back out to the mosque, where Umar was standing with his sword drawn, telling the gathered people that Muhammad was not dead, that he had gone to his Lord as Musa had gone to the mountain and would return. Umar's voice was raised. His sword was out. No one could move past him toward the house. Abu Bakr stood at a distance and began to speak. He praised Allah. Then he said, "Whoever worshipped Muhammad, Muhammad is dead. Whoever worshipped Allah, Allah is alive and does not die." Then he recited the verse, "And Muhammad is not but a messenger. Other messengers have passed on before him. So if he was to die or be killed, would you turn back on your heels?" The sources record what happened next with an economy that carries more weight than any elaboration could. Umar said it was as though he had never heard that verse before. His legs gave way. He sat down. The sword went back into its sheath. And here is where the question lives. The question that the farewell pilgrimage, the address at Arafat, the verse of completion, the return to Medina, and the final morning, all converge to ask. A man who built something this large, who carries this much, who knows at Arafat that he is saying goodbye to more than 100,000 people and speaks accordingly, who at Ghadir Khumm states publicly what he needs to state about Ali, who appoints Abu Bakr to the prayers and Usama to the expedition, and attends to the trusts and the water and the sea walk in the last hours. This man knew that the work had to be handed on. He had said so. He had structured the handover in every way available to him. The question is not whether the handover happened. It did. The question, the one that would haunt Islamic history for 14 centuries, is what exactly was handed on, and to whom, and in what form. Drop your answer in the comments. What do you think he was most trying to ensure would survive him? The structure? The text? The relationship between the two? I read every single one. And if you are not yet subscribed, the next episode goes directly into the answer. The first day after the Prophet ﷺ, the hall of Banu Sa'ida, the man who walked there fast enough to save something that was about to break. Subscribe so you are here when that story opens. The farewell pilgrimage was the last public act of the man who had arrived in Medina 11 years earlier on a she-camel named al-Qaswa, who had let the camel choose where to kneel and then built a mosque on the spot. The address at Arafat was not a list of rules. It was the distilled architecture of a civilization, the principles that made the structure stand, spoken aloud at the highest point of the gathering, in the most sacred season, in front of the largest audience this world had yet assembled. Life is sacred. Property is sacred. Honor is sacred. Women are a trust. The Quran and the Sunnah are your anchors. Treat each other well. Bear witness that I have delivered the message. He had delivered it. The next episode opens the morning after. The hall of Banu Sa'ida. Abu Bakr and Umar walking fast through the streets of Medina, while Ali sits with the body of the Prophet ﷺ, and the city holds its breath. This is where the rightly guided caliphate begins. This is Season 2. Watch the next episode now. It is linked on your screen and in the description. If you have been here for the full first season of this series, from pre-Islamic Arabia to this morning in Medina, you know what this channel is. Share this episode. Put it in front of someone who has never heard this history told this way. One share is all it takes. The House of Wisdom exists because the history deserves to be told with the precision it was lived with. Subscribe. Share. The next era of this story is the one that shaped the world we live in. This is the House of Wisdom, where history is never just the past,